The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.
So welcome everybody to the Integration Society Research Forum. Great to have everyone here. Today we have two excellent scholars joining us, Leigh Price and Bruce Alderman. Leigh will be lecturing on critical realism, and Bruce will be lecturing on integral theory and the kind of neo and post-Wilberian field of integral theory. Leigh's going to go first, so I'll introduce her. So Leigh Price lectures in philosophy, education for sustainability, and special pedagogy at the University of Inland Norway. Her research interests are underpinned by Bhaskarian philosophy of science. She's written extensively on the concept of interdisciplinarity and co-authored a book called Interdisciplinary and Well-Being with Roy Bhaskar and Bert Denemark. Leigh Price's early research in the field of ecology was quantitative. In her master's thesis, she combined multivariate statistical analysis with applied anthropological research known as rapid rural appraisal. Her PhD looked at sustainable development education in business and industry. In addition to critical realism, she's inspired by actor network theory and post-structuralism, Peircean pragmatism, and critical discourse analysis. She heads the research group called Critical Realism, Interdisciplinarity, Sustainability, Education, and Social Science, which supports research that deals with complex problems of the world. She's a director of the Roy Bhaskar Centre and previous general editor of the Journal of Critical Realism. She is associate member of the UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Lifestyles, emeritus research associate at the Institute of Education at University College London, and research associate of Institute of Environmental Learning Research at Rhodes University. So I will also introduce Bruce now so we can dive seamlessly into his presentation. Bruce is an associate director of the Blue Sky Leaders Program at California Institute of Integral Studies. It's a year-long program that brings together big picture thinking, meta-theoretical reflection, deep inquiry, and embodied contemplative practice to leadership formation in a time of meta-crisis. He also teaches multiple courses on consciousness, psychology, and transformation at National University. He is a founding member of Institute of Applied Metatheory, involved from the very beginning and played a formative role. And he's also the co-host of the Integral Stage podcast. He's published essays in the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice, the anthology Dancing with Sophia, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and has books on Tibetan Kum Nai meditation and the space-time knowledge vision coming out later this year. His recent texts on integral perspectival notation and an integral code of ethics are currently circulating for field review. So with that, I'll turn it over to Leigh to present on critical realism, and then Bruce, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Okay, thanks so much for that introduction. So first of all, a great thank you for the invitation to talk about something that's very close to my heart. In fact, I would probably say I've spent my last, in fact, maybe 30 years exploring these ideas and questions. So what I'm going to do is, I believe that many of you here will be new to the ideas of critical realism, so I'm going to give you an introduction to it. I'm then going to try and persuade you as to why it's so important, why I've dedicated my life to it. Just to start off with, I did the Google search for the greatest philosophers a couple of months ago. It'd probably be the same if you did it today. And if you look at all the faces, you'll notice that most of them are white men. There's the odd woman, and there's almost none except for there's almost no people of color. And of course, Bhaskar stands out not only because of his race, in that he is a person of color. He was half Indian and half British, but also he stands out because of his absence. He's not here. I personally believe that he should be, and one day, hopefully, when one makes that search, his name will come up. Okay, to start off with his basic career, he started off with a scholarship at Oxford. He did the usual lectures. He was a very bright student. I won't go into too many details. But when he came to do his PhD, so he was doing the Oxford very famous course called the uh, PhD in politics, philosophy, and economics, or maybe it's philosophy, politics, and economics. And when he came to do his thesis, he wanted to do a thesis on economics, and he wanted to look at poverty in the world and the causes of poverty. And he discovered that he couldn't do that. And so, a bit like when somebody, like, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I once had a kitchen in my house and it had two cupboards that kept bashing into each other. It was a very small, annoying problem. But I worked out, I sort of thought, well, let me shift this cupboard over here. And if I shift that cupboard, then I have to move that. And by the time I finished thinking about it, I realized I would literally have to break down the walls of the kitchen and totally remodel the house in order to stop those cupboards banging into each other. In this case, I bet that kitchen still exists. The cupboards are still banging into each other. But in Roy Bhaskar's case, he found an annoying aspect of philosophy, and he ended up having to change the entire philosophical canon, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But apart from the fact that he was a philosopher and he found that he had to change philosophy just in order to do a simple PhD, he he has subsequently argued for why we need critical realism. He's argued that humanity faces huge challenges, amounting in many cases to crisis. Now, as the Institute of Applied Metatheory states, the meta-crisis is not simply a crisis out there, but a crisis in how we make sense of and make meaning out of the world itself. If our underlying worldview structures are fragmented, inadequate, or misaligned with reality, then the systems and solutions that arise from them will tend to reproduce those same distortions. So Bhaskar, like the Institute of Implied Metatheory, was interested in how we could get ourselves out of this crisis and move towards a world where all the humans and non-humans were able to flourish. And he contended that this crisis was in large part the result of the philosophical discourse of modernity, which he said pivots on an atomistic egocentricity and an abstract universality and its legacy. Now, I won't talk too much about the atomistic egocentricity today, but I will talk a bit about universality and this concept of abstract universality, which I'll just say here is he always gave, he always said there was the postmodernists who taught us about the problems with abstract universality. And he said that to address the crisis would, he argued, require the rejection of the philosophical discourse of modernity and its replacement with an alternative philosophy, such as critical realism or an equivalent. Okay, now Nietzsche once remarked, in order to understand how the abstrusest metaphysical assertions of a philosopher have been arrived at, it is always well and wise to first ask oneself, what morality do they or does he aim at? Roy Bhaskar, unlike many philosophers, was open about the morality that he was aiming for with his philosophy. He wanted to develop a philosophy that could support the fulfillment and flourishing of all beings. Behind his philosophy was therefore a morality based on the idea that the goal of a eudaimonistic society is one in which the free flourishing of each is a condition for the free flourishing of all. And of course, his autobiography is not irrelevant to this. And a while ago, I was invited very generously, along with Roy Bhaskar and several other critical realists, to join the integral theorists in America. And one of the things that I learned, and it was an amazing time for me, and I learned so much from my time with the integral theorists. And one of the things was how important autobiography is. And so, of course, Roy Bhaskar's autobiography is part of this story. And what we see was that because he was a non-white in a very white context he was like one of the few non-white children in his school, He suffered a lot of bullying. He felt that, it wasn't, bullying could happen for many reasons, but it seemed to him like it was because of he was Indian. He tried to, like many people who are bullied, he tried to fit in, he tried to hide the fact that he was not white, so he changed his name from Ram and he called himself Roy. But he was subjected to physical bullying, kicking, that sort of thing. And so he said that the first thing that struck me as a young child was that everyone there was either too fat or too thin, too rich or too poor. I was horrified at the exclusiveness of the caste system and Indian society generally. It didn't take me long to realize that this exclusiveness was also characteristic of British society because it was very, very racist. When asked what this did to his identity, he said, "My tendency was to identify with the underdog. So I'd be inclined to feel very Indian in England, for example, when the Indian cricket team came to England. In 1952, they did terribly poorly and I supported them. Similarly, when I was in India, I would stick up for the good points about England." So, he always was on the side of the underdog. And of course, later on in life, he became an activist. He was strongly influenced by the indigenous movements in Asia, Africa, Latin America. All of his best friends at that time were from the Third World. He even at one point identified with the Algerian Revolutionary Front's Fanon. He was very active in movements in solidarity with the liberation struggles going on in Vietnam and Cuba. When he married his wife, they traveled to Mozambique and Angola as members of the liberation movements in those countries. And he also was part of the Labour Party for a short period. Most of his friends were Benites, which is a kind of very, should we say, sort of quite a left-wing part of the Labour movement. So he was very much an activist. And as I mentioned, he started out trying to understand how global economy leads to poverty, and he ended up dedicating his entire life to philosophy. And as I tell my students, he never completed his PhD. He never actually got to carry out his PhD about poverty. But what he did was he gave us a legacy of philosophy that now allows us to do work that can have real meaning in the world as researchers. So we can divide his work into several phases. Some people say that there were only, some people think of it as maybe only having 3 or 4 phases. I tend to add interdisciplinarity as a 5th phase. So his phase 1 was to develop the concept of transcendental realism, and that's really where he reversed the philosophical errors that go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. In phase 2, he tried to take that philosophy and apply it into the social sciences. And this is where he came through with his breakthrough concept of the transformational model of social activity, which I'll talk about in a bit. In phase 3, he considered how science relates to emancipation and ethics. He applied his philosophy to Hegel and Marx's dialectics, and he sort of reevaluated them. And a very important finding that he discovered here was this concept of absenting. And so he gave he gave absence an ontology. So mostly we think something is not absent, it doesn't exist, therefore it can have no ontology. In the dialectical phase, Roy Bhaskar argued against this and said, no, there are certain real absences, and they can have an ontology. So the absence of food leads to hunger, leads to starvation. This is a very real absence. It has effects. His phase 4 is often called the meta-reality phase, and this really was a shock to the system of the mainstream philosophers who had at that point were mostly quite open to Roy Bhaskar's work. And then along came meta-reality when which is known sometimes as a spiritual turn. And he began to say things like emancipation isn't really possible without some kind of a spiritual grounding. He started to talk about things like creativity and love and non-duality. And then, but around the same time, actually, that he was developing his meta-reality, he was also developing his interdisciplinarity, which was a slightly different phase of his work because he developed his interdisciplinarity in conjunction with other people and in collaboration with other people. So almost entirely where he has co-authored papers or books, it has been related to this idea of interdisciplinarity. And interdisciplinarity is the obvious place to go with his philosophy as a social scientist, or indeed as any scientist who's involved in one of the more complex sciences. Okay, so what is transcendental realism? I should say at the beginning that Roy Bhaskar's philosophy is simple common sense, and although people say it's very hard to understand, funnily enough, it's academics who find it hard to understand. If you explain some of these concepts to people who haven't gone through the academia and don't have PhDs, the concepts that Bhaskar argued for seem just like common sense. So one of the arguments that he makes is that for scientific knowledge to be possible, it must be about something, and that this something may be relatively hidden parts of reality, not only the surface or measurable parts. So transcendental realism argues that reality is therefore layered with a transcendental part. So that's the part is not necessarily obvious, as well as non-transcendental parts, which are the parts that you can see. So real things, which we may not be able to see or hear or otherwise observe, might include things like a potential. So there's the real potential, and or even absences, such as the absence of health I've already discussed. I live in Norway, and we have a real potential for there to be 6 months of snow. That potential wouldn't exist in Africa, in Zimbabwe, for example. Not only are there these real potentials and absences, but there are also real generals. So therefore the general category of cutlery exists. It's common sense. We talk about cutlery in English. Nobody questions whether or not cutlery exists. But philosophers technically do not, many philosophers do not have an ontology for a general like cutlery. Like you can't hold a cutlery in your hand, you can hold knives and forks. Okay, so that general is not seen as a real, it doesn't have an ontology in philosophy. Roy Bhaskar, to the contrary, says categories are real. There's such a thing as cutlery. And similarly, another thing that Bhaskar argues is that there are real emergent things. And this is very relevant for me who has studied ecology, anyone who studies society. So these real emergent ecosystems and societies. Now, again, philosophy has tended to reduce ecosystems to the organisms that make them up. We've tended to reduce society to the people who make up society because we can measure people and things. And society as an emergent entity, what is that? If it's not just made up of people, is it something of, does it exist? And many philosophers would say, no, it doesn't exist. And that if we suggest that if we talk about society, which of course we have to, then this is just a heuristic. It's just a pragmatic thing that we have to do, and that it doesn't actually have an ontology. And Bhaskar argues this from many different ways. I mean, one way that he argues for it is by saying that if you look we know that emeralds are a green stone. All emeralds are green. But he says that we do not say that all emeralds are green because every emerald we've ever seen is green, but rather because the hidden chemical structure of emeralds means that they could not, all things be equal, be other than green. If a gemstone does not look green, even if it is an emerald, because it is being viewed through a red filter. That is, if all things are not equal, this does not detract from its essence as an emerald. That is, there is a real general to which we refer when we talk about emeralds, and underlying this real general is a real essential reason. Bhaskar calls it the alethic truth for why the general exists. So, and often people make a huge mistake talking about the alethic truth, thinking that it's some kind of absolute truth. But it's not, it isn't, that isn't what it is at all. It's just the reason for why something exists. And so it's not to do with that there is ultimately the perfect emerald. It's just that emeralds have a certain chemical structure that means that they have to be green. But that we can come back to a bit later as well. Anyway, so what happens then with this concept of this depth reality is that Bhaskar suggests that reality is therefore layered. So we have those layers that we can measure, that we can see. We have certain things that happen, which may have happened in the past, which we may not be able to measure anymore. But they were once measurable, they have happened. And then we have the layer of the real. Every empirical thing is real. Every actual event is also real. But there's an aspect of the real that is still a potential, maybe, that hasn't happened. But that what Bhaskar would still say exists. So this is his layered reality of the empirical things, real things that may not have happened yet. And another error that is sometimes made is a sort of a shallow understanding of actualism, which is the actual layer. And Roy really developed his understanding of that in terms of correlations of events. So he was specifically interested in events that happen in relation to each other as kind of causal events. And he has a very unique and important way of understanding how these correlational events happen, which is very different to the positivist version of causation. So positivism basically stops at actualism. Humean positivism is a kind of actualism where one event happens and then it always causes another event, and that is a correlation, and that all of our statistics is based on that actualism, and it completely misses out the depth, structural, what could be going, all the structures and mechanisms lying underneath that constant conjunction of events. So normal science, as we understand it, tends to miss out on this huge aspects of reality, the structures and events, which, as I said before, may or may not exist. I mean, they always exist, but they may or may not be actualized as events or empirical things. But they're always going on in the background, so to speak. And so this is quite a different way of understanding science. So here, so if I just look at what this means for ecology. So if we look at the level of the real, which is the structures and mechanisms underneath something, if we look at the deer or tick pathogen parasitic relationship, you have parasitism, which is a certain structure, tendency, or disposition. It is found within ecological communities all over the world. So parasitism is an incredibly common structural relationship. Not all parasites, however, use the same mechanism in order to take advantage of their host. So let's say we have a tick and it has blood-sucking mouthparts. That's its mechanism. And some other pathogens might actually be transferred into the tick via these mouthparts. It's another mechanism through which, so mechanisms are quite different from the structures. But then how does the actual relate to this? So there's a pattern of events in which the presence of ticks is correlated with the presence of disease in the deer, for example. So here we have that correlational actualist relationship. That's also part of reality. And then at the level of the empirical, we can look under our microscopes and we can actually see the pathogens in the ticks in the blood of the deer. And we can actually watch the tick insert its proboscis into the deer and transfer the pathogen. So here we have the structure and mechanisms of parasitism, these actual relationships, what we measure as scientists, often these correlations, epidemiology, and then we have the empirical. We actually watch it happen, and we can do a similar thing with climate change or resilience. So we can have what in climate change, what we have is the structure and mechanisms, the way that atmospheric influences the planetary conditions, and that happens on any planet. This is a general structure of the universe. On our particular planet, the way that it plays out, the mechanism of the climate change on our particular planet is this greenhouse effect, although you have greenhouse effects on other planets too, but our mechanism here is with carbon dioxide. We could actually then measure those patterns, which is what we see people doing all the time, measuring, oh, look at this graph. Here's where we started pumping in carbon dioxide, and here's where the temperature started to raise. So we start to see that correlation. But we can actually stimulate the greenhouse effect in a laboratory. We can take carbon dioxide in a container and show how the more carbon dioxide in a container, if you shine light at it, the faster the temperature rises. So we can literally watch that mechanism happen in the laboratory. Okay, now one of the key things that Roy Bhaskar introduces us to is the concept of retroduction. So Roy Bhaskar talks about retroduction, and again he's shifting his ideas about science. So originally, the way I was taught science, the way most people think of science, is that you have two kinds of logic. You have the logic of induction and the logic of deduction. And induction is this constant conjunctions of events. Every time I don't know, if every time one thing happens, it's followed by another thing. Eventually, you theorize that there's a relationship between these two events. And then you hypothesize if there's a relationship between these two events, then I can test it out in an experiment and see if this actually happens. And if it does, then I can be a little bit more certain about my theory. But Roy Bhaskar added a third logic to this, which he calls retroduction. And retroduction is what happens when a person surmises what must have been to explain what is. So that is, retroduction is used by scientists to surmise the existence of the transcendental structures and mechanisms that explain the empirical layer and the actual layer. So this concept of retroduction is very important. I haven't put a slide here, but I should add that retroduction is backed up by a concept of judgmental rationalism, which is because, you could take a certain number of events or a particular pattern of events, and you could explain them in several different ways. And how would you know which is the better explanation? And judgmental rationality is the process by which you try and decide which is the best explanation for a certain pattern of events. And it's kind of an extension of Karl Popper's concept of falsification. Because when you come up with your different competing theories, one of them will hopefully stand out as being able to explain more of the evidence than the others. And if a theory can't explain all of the evidence, if there's something it can't explain, then in a way it's been falsified, because if it's not completely wrong, it must at least be inadequate if it can't explain all of the evidence. So the theory that you assume is the correct one is the one that best explains everything in competition with other theories. Very important. And of course, this is never going to give you absolute knowledge. So critical realism is known as a fallibilist philosophy. We assume that our theories are fallible. We may have to change our minds if new information arrives. Okay, anyway, so after developing this, so all of this that I've just told you about comes under the philosophy of transcendental realism. And then Roy Bhaskar decided that he'd done great work with his philosophy, but it wasn't very helpful. He needed to apply it. And so he did that in the social sciences. He asked the question, so how will this help us be better social sciences? And in answering that question, he came into the second phase of his work. One of the key things that he discovered, or that he argued for in the second phase, was what we call the transformational model of social activity. And of course, here he was resolving a very long-standing dispute as to the relationship between social structure and agents. And he called this the transformational model of social activity. And essentially, he argued that instead of there being this strong dualism between individuals and society, that they were related in the sense that society is emergent from individuals. And again, this sounds like such common sense, but in a way, because as I've already explained, there's kind of irrealism around this concept of society. At the time, it was sort of assumed that either you had to make some choices. Either individuals were the ones making society, or society was completely determining individuals. Or you could go with the idea that it just depended on your viewpoint. You either saw the individuals, you either looked closely at the forest and saw the individuals, or you took a long view and saw society. But that there was actually no ontological difference between society and individuals, and it was just a pragmatic process of how you were looking at them. And Roy Bhaskar said, no, that's actually not what's happening. Society is actually something qualitatively different from the individuals, although it's dependent on the individuals. It's qualitatively different from them. And the society, and we know that we know it's qualitatively different because we cannot explain society just by using people. And so what in fact happens is that society exists and has existed prior to all of us individuals. We are kind of thrown into society as we're born. Society then influences us, and it influences us in the sense that it gives us enablements and constraints. And then as we grow, or even as babies, I mean, technically we're always part of a relationship with society. We either continue to reproduce society, we never challenge anything, we do exactly what we expected, we follow the norms of society, and so thus we reproduce society. Or perhaps we challenge it and we change it and we transform society. And then when we die, the society continues to exist without us. And this has it's quite dramatically different to other versions of the relationship between structure and agents. And it was only possible because of this concept of ontology. And then we have the dialectic, and I won't go into too much of this because I know we don't have a lot of time. But this was really Roy Bhaskar trying to use his philosophy to see how we can become emancipated. And he tried to work with with Hegel and Marx. And I find that he had an amazing ability to solve problems. When I read Hegel and Marx when I was in my late teens, early 20s. And I remember coming up against a problem which really bothered me, which was that I couldn't understand how Hegel could have used the same dialectical concept of dialectic to explain both emancipatory sort of society changing and knowledge changing. Because I thought to myself at the time, it's just not possible because these are two such totally different things. And yet he says that dialectic works the same for both, knowledge and emancipatory actions and societies. And Roy Bhaskar completely resolved this problem because he said, no, dialectic isn't about the material things, it's not about the actual knowledge, it's not about the actual way that we run society. It's actually about absence. It's about change. It's about the way that our knowledge changes, and it's about the way that society changes. And so he gave dialectic through his ontology of absence. He was able to give he was able to resolve what I thought was a long-standing problem with dialectic, and in quite a remarkable and elegant way. So yeah, so that's his dialectic, where he basically takes Hegel and Marx and he strengthens it. And I really do think that he is one of the great emancipatory thinkers, along the same as equivalent to Marx, for example. Okay, so that was the role of absence. I'll go through this a bit more. And these are the steps in the dialectic. We don't really have much time for that. So maybe I'll just conclude here. I had more slides, but I'll send them to you. You can read them if you're interested. So basically, we can just conclude that Bhaskar's work is profoundly emancipatory. It consists in revindicating ontology to allow for critique of oppressive and unjust systems. It resolves many of academia's problems and dichotomies, such as the problem of induction, or the dichotomies between society and individuals, and between facts and values. And it suggests an emancipatory dialectic which is grounded in, but extends Hegel's dialectic. So I will stop here, and maybe we've got time for a couple of questions.
I think we're going to do questions at the end for both
Okay.
both of the speakers. So thank you so much, Leigh. Really appreciate that. Okay, great. Well, let's turn it over to Bruce.
Thank you very much, Leigh. That was wonderful. And look forward to our conversation at the end. I'll do some sharing here also. Nick, thank you very much. You gave me a very challenging task, which is talk about integral theory to a group who mostly knows it already and could easily be quickly bored. So really, I see we talked about it, and my task really is to look at some post-Wilberian trajectories and also think about what integral theory in itself can still contribute meaningfully to what we're trying to do here at IAM with the Integrative Metatheory 2.0. And so I'll look over the course of the talk, at the living integral contribution, what I perceive it to be, and look at the diaspora. We often talk about a diaspora from integral theory into a lot of different projects. And so looking at that really as a diagnostic field, especially for what our concerns are with IAM, look at it as a meta-level apparatus, and actually what some of the work by myself and others have to do with bringing in topics like, mode, register, relation, things like that aren't covered specifically in AQUIL, not directly, and making an orthopractic proposal for IMT 2.0. So I'll talk about what I'm thinking there. I also will confess that I'm overly busy, and I finished these slides about 15 minutes before I came on. So you are my dry run. I hope you'll be patient with me. So what I want to, how I want to frame it, for what we mean by post-Wilberian, is Wilber's work functions as a generative point of departure, and the projects that we might be looking at typically revise some aspect of integral theory's metaphysics or epistemology or spiritual claims, grammar practice. You will find a variety of different innovations along different pathways. And but all of those I'm considering post-Wilberian. And whatever that project is, it still remains intelligible in relation to its integral inheritance. And that would go for IAM itself. I think what IAM is attempting now is not strictly rooted in integral. It's doing something different. But the roots of a lot of the people involved in it initially came out of that field, and now we're attempting something different. And I want to say to address what could be a feeling of provinciality here, recognizing that what IAM now is including is people coming from quite distinct lineages of thought that didn't have anything to do with integral theory, but entered into dialogue with it at some point. So complex thought or critical realism or even some strains of metamodernism, other things like that. So not presuming that integral is the center or is the thing that needs to be overcome. It's one line among multiples. But in what I'm talking about today is, what has descended from integral into, the field as we find it right now, and the people who are doing thinking and wanting to do thinking alongside these other approaches like critical realism or complex thought. And so the post-Wilberian diaspora reveals the need for a grammar and a practice of inter-metatheoretical coordination. I think we'll have multiple people talk about this over the whole course of the series of talks here. But for participatory or integral post-metaphysical orientations, which I'll talk about a little bit later, the core move has been from generally speaking about universal spiritual architecture more to a plural enactment. And spiritual claims require mode marking. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later. There are also process-based innovations on integral theory, and really recognizing that while integral theory talked, about process, it tend to model things rather statically and structurally, and so a move towards more processual modeling. So there's the grammar of integral or integrative thinking needs a verbal process correction. Integral meta studies, where I primarily put Mark Edwards' work, but also several others. For convenience in this presentation, I'm going to group several people under that. And one key turn is, from thinking about integral as a theory of everything, as Wilber liked to put it, to a theory for anything. So that is, in one sense, a pragmatic kind of turn. And then grammatological and operator, those have to do with my own work with integral grammatology, or Honeycutt's work on operator theorem, some other approaches. So again, turning from the map content to conditions of mapping, and exploring a reflexive grammar for coordination across paradigms or metatheories. So looking at what Wilber's generative contribution has been, whether some of his aqua model is carried forward, in a central way, is maybe an open question. But what he was attempting with his aqua model, and I do think there's a lot of value still to be drawn from using it, but we can also just look at what some of its generative yield is, which is cultivating an anti-reductionist attention, making sure that you consider multiple dimensions and perspectives simultaneously within any discipline, not only between disciplines. Perspectival differentiation, cultivating forms of methodological pluralism, which is of course interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, a developmental sensitivity to the unfolding of perspective and worldview, and knowledge. So we need to carry that forward, even if there are some critiques of how it has been handled or done in more popular integral thinking. Cultivating, again, domain-specific forms of inquiry that are coordinated among others, and attention to enacted disclosure. Here, thinking really about what is, in part, what's the underlying ontology when we look at interdisciplinary or interreligious or intercultural products. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But the suggestion here, and it also relates a little bit to the integrative metatheory 2.0, which is, while I definitely value the move towards a shared worldview or an emergent worldview and emergent story, and I think that is something that we should lean into. I think one thing that we can take from Integral and the diasporic movement is really the importance of orthopraxy over, though not to the exclusion of orthodoxy. A good exemplar in the past would be early Buddhist communities, for instance, contrary to, maybe distinct from early Christian history, for instance. There tended to be more of an emphasis on shared practices and less concern about everybody agreeing on the doctrinal, conclusions that you draw from, those practices. It's more of a pragmatic focus. And while there's still trust that, an emergent understanding will grow out of that, shared set of practices. One of the core moves in integral theory, and that I want to highlight, of course, is its grammatical focus, where it's looking at the pronouns as formalizing person perspectives and basically articulating a grammar of disclosure. So, of course, integral looking at the I, the we, the it, and the its, at interiority, intersubjectivity, objectivity, behavior, and of course systems and structures, and the importance of all of those moves for some of the things that we just talked about before in taking a non-reductionist approach to any subject matter. And I want to emphasize it, in the grammatical function here because of some of the things I lean into in my own work later on. And so, one of the elements of integral also is, a focus on, the Aqua model, of course, but then also integral methodological pluralism and Wilber's 8 zones that he's drawn from that. And one way to look at it is that, Aqua insists on making certain distinctions or avoiding certain collapses between aspects of reality that, in different contexts do tend to get collapsed. So not confusing states and stages, for instance, not confusing lines of developments for types or vice versa, not confusing realization of maybe certain insights or spiritual truths with actual integration, which takes a lot deeper work and development. Not collapsing culture and system. We can find that going in both directions, where there's either a systemic reduction or cultural reduction, and also not collapsing method and ontology. Though I want to say here that while there's this differentiation and a tension to collapse, it's not a simple black and white either or. There's also significant entanglement that we need to think about among all of these domains. But nevertheless, it's a practice of differentiation, and then what we do in navigating the seams of that differentiation, that is a form of practice that I think we carry forward. So just looking at integral as a practice technology, looking from the inside and outside of phenomena, attending to individual and collective dimensions, distinguishing specifically experience, behavior, culture, and system, looking at those in dynamic interrelation, asking which methods disclose which domains, and paying attention to that, more of an enactive epistemology, tracking development without reducing everything to development, what Mark Edwards would call altitude sickness, and of course resisting single lens capture. So I think these are at least for people who've been practicing within the integral arena overall, these are, I think, real yields of the couple decades of integral practice. And it's not that these things are exclusive to an integral, Wilber theoretic understanding by any means, but this constellation grows, I think, fairly cleanly out of what integral has been up to over the last number of decades. And, so there are many, many outgrowths from integral theory, what sometimes is called the integral diaspora. And each, I want to speak of them in terms of several clusters, each of which shifts the center of gravity or the focus. So I'll talk about participatory and post-metaphysical corrections to spiritual universalism, also processual corrections to structural reification, methodological corrections to grand synthesis habits, and grammatological interface, notational and operator-based corrections to map content focus. I know that's a mouthful. I hope I'll clarify that in the next coming slides. To say a little bit about, the participatory and the integral post-metaphysical approaches, Jorge Ferrer and others out of CIS and some other places really began arguing, a couple decades back for a participatory epistemology, which challenged some of what tended to be the neo-perennialism at the heart of integral thinking at the time, and pushing for a more plural and an active orientation towards spiritual phenomena or cultural phenomena. Wilber, without maybe adequate acknowledgement, took a note from Ferrer and eventually proposed his own integral post-metaphysical approach. Ferrer himself would not call his approach post-metaphysical. He called it participatory, but Wilber, in his post-metaphysical framing, began to argue, more along these lines of thinking about modes of enactment rather than, so that when we're talking about the ontology of something, we're talking in part about modes of enactment. Later conversations with critical realism will bring some caution and some correction to some of that, but that's a whole movement that was taking place in one of these post-integral, post-Wilberian developments. There are also process-based approaches focusing more on event becoming and immediacy. Benita Roy stands in here as an exemplar who attempted that a couple decades back. Integral meta-studies and bridge building, from moving from the self-contained synthesis that was integral thinking to a reflexive meta-inquiry and cross-framework encounter. So that Mark Edwards has brought material in around that, but others too, like Sean Hargens and others. So looking at the diagnostic yield of that is that theory, method, data, interpretation, ontology, and complexity require disciplined meta-level coordination. And then another cluster, I'm putting myself together for the grammatological is mine, together with someone like Joel Morrison with his interface philosophy, or Christopher Honeycutt with his operator theorem, all of them looking at conditions of mapping and developing meta-theoretical apparati, in a sense. So this, basically I'm suggesting with this survey that, that there's a plurality in grammars, warrants, registers, and practices that appear in this diaspora, and that is not accidental. It's actually, I think something important to think about what we're doing with Integrative Metatheory 2.0. Are we pushing towards a single, kind of narrative or an ultimate model that brings all of them together, or are we leaning into practices and approaches and dispositions that can actualize deeper, cross-paradigmatic encounter without necessarily implying the adoption of a single overarching view. So for the participatory post-metaphysical stream, some of the key people have been Jorge Ferrer. Tom Murray has written a good deal about post-metaphysical emphases in integral thinking or extensions of integral thinking. Edward Berge, Layman Pascal, and myself have all worked in this area, especially through our Integral Post-Metaphysical Spirituality Forum. So diagnostic yield for what I think this cluster is moving from universal spiritual architecture to a participatory enactment. Spiritual claims need mode marking. We'll say more about that also again in the future. And the kind, force, and scope of claims must be more clearly articulated. Wilber has attempted that a little bit with his, cosmic addressing, but there are other ways that we can approach that. What for the spiritual mode marking? When a framework invokes spirit, emptiness, divinity, eros, non-duality, the sacred. What are we looking at? Is this a phenomenological claim, a theological or metaphysical one, a contemplative one, which is practice-based realization, a mythopoetic or heuristic one? Is it serving as a symbolic lure or an orienting device? Is it developmental or ethical? Is it a stage-related or a normative articulation? So when we get into Honeycutt's work, we'll look at this about there tends to be a danger of register collapse among these, and it leads to kind of confused discourse. So this is something that we need to pay attention to, and that's part of the yield of this diasporic movement. Process-based corrections, especially Benita Roy, she tried to emphasize the need to move from the more static structural presentation of integral to a process view, focusing on view. What's the underlying metaphysical assumptions that inform even metatheories, and I picked that up later with my grammatology. And so integral's pronounal and architectonic grammar requires verbal correction, and it's not a replacement, but it's an extension. It's an addition so that we don't lock ourselves into one kind of grammatical mode of meaning making. Reality is also event, movement, transformation, and enactment. And a mature integral methodological or metatheoretical approach must coordinate structural and processual grammars without reducing either. And I just wanted to put Steve McIntosh here. He doesn't really do a lot of direct process-oriented thinking, but in his work he leans a lot into developmental thinking and evolutionary themes, and he's done his own diasporic, kind of development of integral Wilberian thought. So I wanted to just include him among the voices. Integral meta studies from Mark Edwards and others. I'm not spending a lot of time here because I know that Mark will be speaking later. But yeah, moving from integral metatheory as a grand synthesis to integral meta studies as a reflexive research field. So Mark Edwards brings us integral meta studies, saying that we need to look at not only metatheory but also meta method, metadata analysis, meta hermeneutics. Sean S. Bjorn Hargens brought us, of course, integral ecology. He had his meta-integral project, and later he did a lot of bridge-building work among Wilber, Bhaskar, and Morin. Paul Marshall also attempted this with his critical integral realism, bringing integral theory into sustained dialogue with Bhaskarian critical realism and Morin's complex thought. And Nick Headland, of course, also coordinating with Sean on a number of the metatheory books and on the development of his own visionary realism. So integral inquiry needs institutionalized, researchable, critically reflexive meta-level practices. Some of the approaches that we're engaging with now were already situated within academia. Wilber's work started out more of a popular social narrative kind of work that has then tried to move into academia and gain credibility in academia with varying levels of success. But some of what we're doing here, I think at IAM, could help with that. For the interface operator grammatological stream, Joel Morrison, who, bless him, he recently just passed away too young. I don't know if he's in his 40s or 50s, but he just passed away, and it's unfortunate. But he developed interface philosophy, which, gives a number of interesting intellectual products. One of which that I've really drawn on in my own work is his nested kind of using a yin-yang model to look at the interrelationships and entanglement of epistemology, ontology, and then the epic and the ontic. It's a rich model that I think overlaps with and complements critical realist thinking and others. And Christopher Paget Honeycutt is not well known, but I've been in dialogue with him recently on his operator theorem, and he's really interested in in making a kind of a reading hygiene and paying attention to register collapse in philosophical and metatheoretical discourse. And then I've been working on my integral grammatology and integral perspectival notation, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So diaspora points beyond itself. It's saying, what kind of claim is this? What register does it operate in? By what mode is it warranted? Through what grammar is it articulated? In what relation does it stand to other frameworks? So we need, IMT 2.0 requires a grammar of metatheoretical encounter. One thing I want to say, just, some complementary tools that I think need to be brought in. Latour's work on modes of veridiction, Honeycutt's work on register articulation, the register of articulation, and focusing on register collapse, and then my own work on the grammar and relation and the hidden autochoreographies, the kind of the implicit coordination of ontological elements within any philosophical or metatheoretical framing. Integral grammatology looks at that. And so, for instance, in what Leigh was talking about with cutlery or with other things, there's a particular integral grammatological reading that you could give to that. So you're with Latour, we're looking at what mode or what braid of modes does this domain establish its truth, and science, law, religion, politics, technology, etc. They each have their own felicity conditions, and frameworks often differ by truth practice, not merely by proposition. And so mode marking helps prevent category mistakes or veridictive colonization, which, that's a similar thing to what Wilber addressed, with the colonization of one quadrant by another. Honeycutt looks at register collapse. There are different registers. Is it instrumental? Is it descriptive? Is it structural? Is it heuristic? So there are sets of questions that we can look at for each one of those things. Improve our reading hygiene. I'm going to go quickly because I know we don't have that much time. With integral grammatology, I identified 6 philosophemes based on parts of speech that seem to inform metaphysical commitments of a lot of different philosophical and metatheoretical systems. So does it emphasize perspective, address, and person position? Does it emphasize entity, substance, or structure? Does it emphasize event, process, or becoming? Does it emphasize quality, value, appearance, aspect? Does it emphasize mode, manner, style, prepositional, relation, mediation, co-presence? The argument here is that no system of thought lives only in one of these, but it does tend to privilege one or two of them over others and then subordinate the rest in the meaning making that it does. And a lot of confusion happens, or at least impasses happen when these underlying commitments aren't properly recognized. So basically, grammatology center, what grammatical center organizes the framework? What does that grammar make especially visible? And what does it tend to background? What does it tend to absence? Right? So any grammatological organization will both presence things and absence things, to speak about that in critical realist terms. Which grammars are subordinated, suppressed, or treated as derivative? What conflicts arise because frameworks are operating through different grammars of disclosure? I won't dwell here. One one practice that I wanted, I picked up in a paper was looking at homeomorphic equivalence between critical realism, integral theory, and complex thought. Critical realism has the idea of co-presence. Complex thought has the idea of kind of the hologrammatic relations, and integral theory has some of its deeper unpacking of non-duality. And I chose the prepositional operator within, with a slash between it, with/in, as a prepositional relation that links these homeomorphic equivalents of a particular kind of relation across three different metatheories, and suggesting that this is a pivotal form of relationship that we enact between cultures, between systems. We can recognize that in some way, each one of the systems enfolds the alethic potential of the other systems in its own way, but not all of them bring forward all those elements uniquely or equally or in equally fully developed manners. And so while each one can enfold the others and participate with the others, each one is generatively and productively in dialogue because they unfold those potentials uniquely. And so it's not, a question of whether integral contains the others or critical realism contains the others. They all contain each other in important ways, and they all have different yields in terms of how they've unfolded those things at their present level of development. I use the word heno-ontology to talk about this. Heno-theology kind of is a theology of a shifting one. Shiva might be the center, or Vishnu might be the center. And each one of those is valid in its own way. And so ontochoreography is looking at what happens when we shift the one. Are we leaning into process? Are we leaning into structure? Are we leaning into relation? What happens when we do that in terms of how our overall worldview, our model emerges? And what, again, is disclosed, what is hidden, what is subordinated. Yeah, some of the recent work I've been doing, I've taken some of the aspects of this, Wilber's integral math, where he's looking at the relationship among different perspectives and in the disclosure of reality. And I've tried to extend that by, instead of just the operator of X, where you just look at this perspective in relationship to that perspective, you can bring in different prepositional relations to think about how perspectives are in relationship with each other. Are they in recursive relation, hologrammatic relation? Are they in subordinating relation? Are they in objectifying relation? So here's some on the right, some examples of different forms of operators that could be used. There's many, many others. You can just hear this kind of speaks for itself. I gave an example of the notation to a consultant recently, and he used it to analyze a staff meeting of some, doctors and nurses around, where a particular breakdown in communication happened among them, because, he was able to identify it by certain predominance of relational modes among others in their perspectival exchange. So it can be used at a local level like that, but it can also be used at an inter-metatheoretical level. Yeah, I've also been thinking about orthopraxy and ethical infrastructure. Orthopractic disciplines: dialogue, inquiry, attunement, translation and critique, mode recognition, register marking, repair, and ontochoreography. So the whole field of metatheoretical practice involves, certain ethical concerns, which is something that Rob tasked me to think about a number of years ago. And I started thought on that, and we never really fully developed it. But more recently, I've developed a code for at least thinking about what we've learned over the years in terms of our attempts to enact holistic thinking, metatheoretical thinking, big picture thinking, and whether that's been in spiritual or philosophical or theoretical contexts. And so there's a whole range of ethical things to look at here. And so in thinking about the three phases, the alpha, the beta, and the gamma of integral or IMT 2.0, where gamma is a synthetic practice. I want to suggest that gamma really involve articulation of a series of orthopraxis, right? Metapraxis, rather than too early settling on a model or a narrative, but instead a grammar, that we really want to look at a grammar of practices that allow for the ongoing synthetic exploration of the alpha and the beta modes of metatheory. So I'm recognizing that, I have probably gone a bit over my time, so thank you. And I had to rush a bit, but I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was fantastic. So two wonderful presentations. Let's open it up now for questions and discussions on both presentations.
Just to say thank you. That was fantastic. And I really hope we get your slides, because there's lots of people I'd like to read more about. So that was really great. And I actually work with somebody who's very interested in a subject called communicology. And she's also a critical realist. And a lot of what you were saying reminded me of things that she says. Do you know about communicology? And
no, but it sounds like I need to.
yeah, I should put you in touch with her. She's been working on it for a long time, and I keep telling her she has to write a book. But that whole process of the different kinds of grammars and where things find their truth, for example, and just the practical usage of it to avoid conflict. And she always tells me how this is so practical. And I can see that from your example of the nurse, of the doctors, it's a really practical framework that you're giving us here. So, so definitely have a look up what communicology is. And my colleague is called Lena Nihus. So she considers herself a communicologist, and she's also a she's a good critical realist too. So it was really nice to see you bringing in some critical realist concepts there as well. So nice.
Wonderful, thank you. And I really loved hearing about critical realism again, because it's been a few years since I've engaged with it directly, and I did get to meet Roy at one of the integral theory conferences, and he's such a warm person, and I'm so glad you brought in the biographical, because I think that's such a key piece in thinking about how we embody all of this and how it expresses and what we're expressing. On the geeky side, in terms of what you were thinking about, I took some notes here on thinking about, for instance, the cutlery and that approach. And so, for instance, like grammatologically, you could look at the nounal. It would be in part a nounal claim, and it's showing that categorical structure and generative powers. It's showing the reality of categorical structure and generative kinds, the generative powers of kinds. But it's a complex nounal approach in that it also involves a prepositional grammar that would show the relational constitution of the kind, and modal grammar revealing its practical, pragmatic mode of existence, verbal grammar revealing its enactive and processual life. And so that's kind of what I mean by ontochoreography, is one thing sits forward in terms of the articulation, but when you dig into it, you find these other elements in terms of how it's actually unpacked and held. And so how this is not Aristotelian substance, but it actually is, quite different. And so, what is the choreography that you're engaged in there to hold that constellation of ontological commitments?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're talking about, but from a critical realist perspective, you could never answer the question of what constitutes cutlery without understanding what Bhaskar would call the object slash if. So he, so just to give an example, in the context of, say, an Victorian English household, a chopstick would not be classified as cutlery probably because they would have their food wouldn't be cut in a way that they could actually use a chopstick as cutlery. So literally the objective would disqualify a chopstick as being seen as cutlery. So it is entirely sort of contextually based, and there's no absolute perfect sort of idea of cutlery out there. And that's what Bhaskar was arguing about. There's no abstract universal. There's no perfect cutlery. Yeah.
It's embodied and contextual.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. And Rob, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I just want to appreciate both of your presentations and to remind, I suppose, everybody that what's so fruitful about stepping back and hearing these different approaches, these different integrative meta theories, is you can feel some of the strength. You can feel the strength of the ontological approach from critical realism and the depth ontology and the realism, right? The constant, as you reminded us, Leigh, and Roy also many times said, like, it's a philosophy of common sense. Like, it brings us back to the real, it brings us back to the grounded. The contribution of Integral is its really great sort of gesture to epistemology and the different ways in which we can walk amongst different perspectives. And we've often talked about the Institute as and grammar as being one of the things that we're really focusing on. I'm beginning to think of the Institute in a way as kind of a grammatical commons. Like, how do we find a grammatical commons for the 21st century that allows us to have unified theory of knowledge, integral philosophy, critical realism, Latour's modes of existence, metamodernism, process thought, like, these complex thought in productive dialogue, because in a way that's a microcosm of the metacritical problem writ large globally, which is how to find some form of more holistic integrative sense making, and then the action that proceeds from it. So it just, this work just feels super pressing, and I want to just thank you both for doing that. And that was it. It was just this sense that, like, I was really appreciating you being here, because it's wonderful work.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
It is lovely to be here.
Yeah. I'll just take a plug for what Rob said and for Bruce's grammatology. As he knows, I love that. I bet, and we had some very private, Mount Sophia. If you haven't checked out Mount Sophia, Bruce, send the link. It's a beautiful thing.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Brendan.
Yeah. Again, also, I echo all this is great. I guess what comes up for me, a question for both of you. These seem like really pressing and important ideas, obviously. How would you imagine giving them some kind of form that can make them more tractable for people? Are there certain tools or representations or, arguably, one of the things that I think people find when they pick up like an integral theory book or something is, oh, here's a great map and I can put this to use, and all of a sudden there's some kind of clarity, and it kind of strikes you as a kind of almost transparent thing once it's there. I can use this, and this helps clarify something. Particularly in the context of the work that we're trying to do here, I wonder if you have an intuition of like what might be some outputs, some formulations of these important ideas that could somehow be put out into the world that people could then use as sort of immediately utilizable tools that could kind of help them embody these ideas and bring them to life?
I would say, from totally out of place on the critical realist side, I'm deeply hungry for that. There is so much richness in the critical realist field, and it's speaking to a level of information processing that a lot of the public can't do. And even though I'm looking deep, for some practical translations that I really hope to see. And I'll just share one thing very quickly, which is I've been working on this, so I want to show you where this goes. So this is actually a workbook that takes you through how to do this perspectival notation, which people may or may not want to learn all of that, but it's got the whole thing. It's about 200 pages of different examples of perspectival constructions, and then invitations to try it out yourself and learn the language. It may be that people don't ever work with a book like that, but I might be able to put something on a website that would be more easily interactive, and even keep some of the even the notation in the background, with in the front would be plain language, and then the back would be the notation, something like that. That would make it more digestible. So that's the one thought around a potential project.
Have you played around with like dropping that into Claude or ChatGPT or some AI and say, make a 12 card social media share that kind of condenses these terms in a way, or anything like that?
I just asked Claude if Fable 5, Fable 5 could basically build me a website, to operationalize this, and it said, yeah, probably. So I may try that if I want to spend all those tokens. So
that's great. Okay, I think we got time for one more comment. Leigh?
Yeah, just to go back to the question of how we could make this more accessible. It's a question I ask myself, I'd say every day. And in a way, my presentation today is kind of reflects a little bit of my solution to that, which is partly to really capitalize on this concept of common sense. And part of what makes critical realism so complicated was, in a way, a consequence of Roy Bhaskar being so bullied. He knew that any tiny detail that he got wrong, anybody who's bullied will tell you this, unless you're absolutely perfect, you are going to be bullied. And of course, eventually you work out if you're bullied. That doesn't matter how perfect you are, you're still going to be bullied. But you learn to try and be absolutely perfect. And so Roy Bhaskar tried to create a philosophy which covered every possible argument. And of course, the consequence of that was that he's quite hard to understand. So it's kind of ironic. But the good thing is he has given us such a strongly argued piece of work. But then we do have to try and make that more accessible. And so that is something that I do think about and I am working on. And the only advice I'd give to anyone who's new to the subject is be very wary of some of the attempts to sort of summarize critical realism. I know Roy is difficult to read, but if you can read him, try, because it's nothing, I don't have anything against, and certainly Roy didn't have anything against people trying to interpret him. But the problem is that there's just so many different interpretations that it just becomes very confusing. So, you have Andrew Collier's version, my version, Mervyn's version of critical realism, and all of these versions eventually just make things even more complicated. So if you can go to the source, I would really strongly advise that. And what we are lucky to have are interviews with Roy by Savita Singh and Mervyn Hartwig. And I find those are the most accessible because he's just talking. So if you're looking for an accessible introduction to critical realism, I would really go with his interviews by Savita Singh and Mervyn Hartwig.
That would be the formation of critical realism, that book, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's right. And Fathoming the Depths of Reality.
Yeah.
With Savita Singh and Roy. Yeah. And
then I would also recommend Enlightened Common Sense, which is a great overview of the whole system by
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And also not often forgotten was his original PhD thesis. And Bruce, you would probably find that very interesting because that is where he deals with grammar. And he deals with some of these questions of, how we speak and what are prepositional knowledge and all of that. And he deals with that best in his original thesis, which is published posthumously.
Wonderful.
I forget what it's called, actually. It's called Empiricism and the Metatheory of the Social Sciences.
Empiricism and the Metatheory of Social Sciences. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. This has been awesome. Thanks to everyone for showing up, and thanks to our amazing presenters. Really appreciate all the lifetime of work that you guys have put into this to be able to share with us. So yeah, really appreciate you all, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.